Wait, he thinks what? That if they just fight a defensive war, eventually the Soviets will sue for peace. What has he been smoking? Huh? Same thing as Hitler, you guess. yeah, that's about right. Okay, see ya. August 13th, 1943. Sicily has been under attack by the Allies since July 10th, and since that day, they have been almost constantly advancing. There hasn't been much the Axis could really do to hold them back, and this week comes the inevitable. This week, the Germans and Italians evacuate Sicily. And now, a word from our sponsor. That's right. 9 out of 10 doctors recommend joining the Time Ghost Army.
Be an angel and come and help.
I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Germans began withdrawing in the Soviet Union to the Hagenstellung, and the Soviets flattened out the Orel salient and took Orel itself. They also took Belgorod with their large offensive further south. The Americans took Munda on New Georgia, and then decided they'll leapfrog past the heavily defended Kolumbangara and hit a less defended island. And on Sicily, the Allied attacks continued. There are a bunch of other attacks that continue this week, though. In the Kuban, the final phase of Ivan Petrov's Soviet offensive begins the 7th. Andrei Grechko's 56th Army makes a few local penetrations, but the Axis lines are soon restored. Petrov stops attacks the 12th, and Stavka agrees to calling the whole thing off the 13th. His two offensives have cost North Caucasus Front some 160,000 casualties, which is like 40% of its total manpower. German 17th Army has taken only around 22,000, so they inflicted 7 times as many casualties as they took. In the near future, Stavka will decide that such offensives here are a waste of resources and will transfer 7 divisions to the Stavka Reserve and order the front over to defense. But of course, the Soviets are still attacking all over. In fact, as the week gets going, the gap they've torn between 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf is now 50 kilometers wide. The German SS divisions rerouted from further south as reinforcements are arriving, but they aren't in position to fight until the 9th. On the 7th, the Soviets enter Borisovka. Thing is, the heavy fighting there, and last week at Tomarovka, and also at Graivoron, has tied down a lot of Nikolai Vatutin's infantry. So the tank armies that made the breakthroughs are way out ahead and don't have the support that they might well need. On the 10th, the Soviets crossed the Merchik at Alexandrovka. The next day, they cut the Poltava-Kharkov railway 50 kilometers west of Kharkov, and on the 12th, take Chuguyev southeast of Kharkov, hoping to surround the city. The threat to Poltava is also now becoming a real worry for the Axis, since if it falls, the forces in Kharkov will be cut off, and the ones to the south will also be in serious danger. The 3rd Panzer Corps is therefore brought back north from the Taganrog area. By this stage of the war, the Germans are forced to employ their panzer divisions as a mobile reserve to cover weak spots in their defenses. The Germans have been fighting back hard, of course, and a counterattack near Bogodukhov the 11th and 12th stops a lot of Soviet units, destroys a lot of armor, and gains some ground. But it also has the effect of allowing the Soviet infantry to finally catch up with the armor, and today, that armor begins renewed attacks. Now, already on the 12th, Werner Kempf wants to evacuate Kharkov, and Erich von Manstein is okay with this, but Adolf Hitler says absolutely not. It must be held whatever the cost. So, spoiler! Tomorrow, Manstein will replace Kempf with Otto Wöhler. The detachment will soon enough become the 8th Army. As for Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, they are gearing up for a counterattack of their own, even though after 6 weeks of fighting, they only have like 100 tanks and assault guns in working condition. Something about Manstein here. At this point, he thinks that the best outcome the Germans can hope for is to grind down the Red Army in a bunch of defensive battles until the Soviets sue for peace. However, the desire of Manstein to fight a war intended to exhaust the Red Army and create the conditions in which a negotiated peace might be possible was just as fanciful as Hitler's economic argument. The Allied powers had made clear at the Casablanca Conference there could be no peace until and unless Hitler and the Nazis were removed from power. And further north, at 4:40 a.m. the 7th, also as the week begins, the Soviet Western Front launches its own offensive, ideally to reach Smolensk. The main thrust is between Yelnya and Spas-Demensk. The attackers have a 3-to-1 advantage, but the terrain heavily favors the defenders, and there are loads of fortified villages to deal with as well. The initial attacks are all repulsed, but over the next few days, small gains of a kilometer or two are ground out. There are threats of breakthroughs, and the Germans in some sectors realize they will have to pull back since they don't have reserves to prop up their lines. Gotthard Heinrici orders the evacuation of Spas-Demensk the 12th, and the Soviets enter it today. The town is completely deserted. Also today, Andrei Yeremenko's Kalinin front joins that offensive as well, attacking northeast of Dukhovshchina. Those are far from the only Allied attacks this week, for the Allied advance in Sicily continues. On the 7th, the British capture Adrano and move on Bronte. As for the Americans, the Axis have been holding the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division back at the San Fratello line on the coast, and it is well fortified. So the morning of the 8th, the Americans make an amphibious landing behind the Axis. The enemy has already mostly evacuated, however, so this is not as effective as it could have been a few days earlier, but it has another consequence. See, back on the 2nd, Luftwaffe boss Smiling Albert Kesselring approved an evacuation plan, leaving the timing up to local Panzer Corps commander Hans-Valentin Hube. But that landing the 8th leads to worries that more such operations would sabotage the defenses further along the coastal route. But it's more than just the landing. North of Mount Etna, the Americans capture Cesaro and the British Bronte. And the British have also by then pushed 13 kilometers beyond Catania. So on the 8th, Kesselring gives Hube permission to start evacuating now. The 9th, Alfredo Guzzoni, Axis overall commander on the island, gets the word from Comando Supremo. He is ordered to move his command to Calabria, and though he already began evacuating some units from Messina last week, he now picks up the pace. That day, the next defensive line, the Tortorici Line, is activated. American Commander George Patton wants to beat British Commander Bernard Montgomery to Messina, so he does order another amphibious attack behind the enemy lines. And before dawn the 11th, 1 cruiser and 6 destroyers cover landings east of Cape Orlando near Brolo. The Germans do, however, manage to pull back a lot of their force over the next day. The withdrawing German forces made extensive use of demolitions to delay the Allied advance. Aside from obvious targets such as bridges and tunnels, the coastal roads and mountain passes also offered demolition opportunities. In turn, the Allied air forces attempted to stymie the German withdrawal with an air campaign against bridges and narrow passes. This leads to the vital route through Randazzo being known as the Death Road. Randazzo finally falls today, as the week ends, but already on the 11th, German and Italian forces begin evacuating Sicily. This will take 6 days, 70 naval ships, and 50 rubber boats, and is remarkably effective. The Allies, although warned by Ultra of the German withdrawal, no longer had the necessary reserve strength to stop this movement. As a result, the Allied army's task was to be the more difficult when, less than a month later, they invaded the Italian mainland. When the evacuation begins, Patton's forces are 80 kilometers from Messina, and Monti's are 55. The evacuation is called Operation Leergang, and the crossing sites were prepared weeks ago. Ernst Gunther Bade is commander of the Straits of Messina, which are under 3 kilometers wide at the narrowest points. And by now, he has at least 333 AA guns, and possibly as many as 500, ready for action. They cover the multitude of boats from Allied sorties that destroy but 23 craft during the evacuation, according to the Allies, and only 15 according to the Axis. Over 100,000 men, some 10,000 vehicles, 47 tanks, and nearly 200 big guns make it across to mainland Italy. I just read that quote by Martin Gilbert a minute ago that the Allies didn't have the reserve strength to stop this, but there's there's really more to it than that, right? I mean, you got to look at the players involved. Like Mediterranean Fleet Commander Andrew Cunningham is well aware of the Axis coastal defenses, and also how large warships were sunk by not nearly as tough Ottoman defenses in the Dardanelles in 1915. He isn't that willing to sacrifice his warships until the defenses have been neutralized by air. However, the air forces had little confidence that the numerous coastal artillery sites could be knocked out in the face of such intense flak, and focused their attacks directly against the evacuation sites. Furthermore, the tactical air forces at the time were heavily committed to air support of the Allied ground forces and could not maintain a permanent presence over the straits, especially at night. Let's also not forget that the boats used are small targets, and the trip takes less than half an hour. And the Allied commanders are scattered between North Africa, Sicily, and Malta, which makes coordination a hassle, and you get air and naval power that isn't willing to take huge losses to really hurt the evacuation, and that also doesn't really get strong orders to do so. I mentioned General Patton earlier, and he's involved in some controversy this week. Well, he was last week when he physically assaulted Charles Kuhl, a soldier with what we now call PTSD. We covered that on our day-by-day coverage of the war on Instagram, which is also here under the community tab. But this week on the 10th is another incident, this time involving Private Paul Bennett. Now, the guy attacked last week hasn't been in the army all that long, but Bennett has served for 4 years. He has had exactly 0 medical history in that time until a friend of his was wounded last week on the 6th. His medical report says that since that happened, he's nervous and he can't sleep. He's at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, and he does have other symptoms: a fever, dehydration, fatigue, and confusion. He has also requested to return to his unit, but medical officers have turned that request down. He was sent down to the rear echelon by a battery aid man, and there the medical aid man gave him some tranquilizers that made him sleep. But still, he was nervous and disturbed. On the next day, the medical officer ordered him to be evacuated, although the boy begged not to be evacuated because he did not want to leave his unit. Patton visits the troops there the 10th. Bennett is apparently sitting huddled over and shivering. Patton asks him what's wrong, and he says it's his nerves, that he just can't stand the shelling anymore. So Patton slaps him and says, "Your nerves, hell! You're just a goddamn coward! Shut up that goddamn crying! I won't have these brave men who've been shot at seeing this yellow bastard sitting here crying!" Patton slaps him again and tells the receiving officer not to admit Bennett. He then tells Bennett he's going back to the front lines and threatens him with a firing squad if he doesn't, ending off with, "In fact, I gotta shoot you myself, you goddamn whimpering coward." He then pulls out his pistol. The medical officer separates Patton and Bennett, and Patton leaves the tent. Almost needless to say, the sight of the general threatening a patient with a gun disturbs the medical staff there. A report is submitted to 2nd Corps Commander Omar Bradley, who locks it away in his safe. But another copy of the report manages to reach Dwight Eisenhower, and he starts an investigation. Well, next week he starts an investigation. Now, it has already been decided that Patton's 7th Army will not be part of the planned invasion of Italy. In fact, it's ordered broken up a few days from now on the 18th. On the 17th, Eisenhower will pen a letter to Patton that contains some pretty sharp words and ends with, "I must so seriously question your good judgment and your self-discipline as to raise serious doubts in my mind as to your future usefulness." Patton will apologize to both of the men he assaulted and expresses remorse to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower will tell Army Chief of Staff George Marshall about the incidents, though he believes that behavior will not continue. As for the media, well, there may very well be a big stink about this if it becomes public, and if that should ever happen, well, I guess I'll cover it here when it does. Something that's not being reported in the media this month is the top-secret Allied leadership meeting, the Quebec Conference, codenamed Quadrant. Or maybe that's because it hasn't yet begun. Or has it? Some sources say it begins the 13th. The Canadian Encyclopedia says the 10th. Encyclopedia Britannica says the 11th. Wikipedia says the 17th. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff website says it starts tomorrow on the 14th. Really. So, I'm going to roll with the Joint Chiefs, so I'll cover it next week. Tonight, on the 13th, according to Martin Gilbert, Winston Churchill is Franklin Roosevelt's guest at his home in Hyde Park, New York. It is here that the two agree to fully share all the work being done by their nations on an atomic bomb. They will sign an agreement, which is shown only to their inner circles, to do the actual research and manufacturing of the bomb in the U.S., but as a complete joint project. There will be 4 articles of agreement set down. 1. Britain and the U.S. will never use this weapon against each other. 2. They won't use it against a third party without each other's consent. 3. They won't talk about the project to any third party without each other's consent. And 4. This covers the post-war possibilities of atomic research and development. Churchill, as the article notes, expressly disclaims any interest in these industrial and commercial aspects beyond what may be considered by the President of the United States to be fair and just in harmony with the economic welfare of the world. The U.S. Army has recommended that atomic secrets developed at Los Alamos remain American secrets. So Churchill has won Roosevelt over on this, but not on his other ideas, which I went over last week. In terms of military actions, Roosevelt sticks by his Joint Chiefs recommendations that an American general, and not British Chief of Staff Alan Brooke, will be in charge of next year's invasion of France, although the British can nominate someone to Southeast Asian Supreme Command. The two leaders will join the combined Chiefs of Staff when the conference begins tomorrow. And here are a few notes to end the week. On the 13th, the U.S. 5th Air Force sends out planes from Australian bases to bomb the Balikpapan oil fields in Borneo. That same day, American bombers conduct the first bombing raid over Austria of the war. And this week, Adolf Hitler calls for the beginning of work on the Panzerstellung, a defense line that is to run from Narva on the Gulf of Finland to near Melitopol on the Sea of Azov. And the week comes to an end, with the Soviets failing in the Kuban, but advancing most everywhere else in their offensives, even as Hitler refuses to evacuate Kharkov. The Axis conceding and evacuating Sicily, though, and Patton losing his cool once again. Prit Buttar, in Retribution, writes a bit about Hitler and how much of a problem for the Wehrmacht he has become. Well, not just the Wehrmacht, for Hitler dominates every aspect of German leadership, be it military, political, economic, and diplomatic, right? Albert Speer will write in his memoirs the following. Amateurishness was one of Hitler's dominant traits. He had never learned a profession, and basically had always remained an outsider in all fields of endeavor. Like many self-taught people, he had no idea what real specialized knowledge really meant. Without any sense of the complexities of any great task, he boldly assumed one function after another. Unburdened by standard ideas, his quick intelligence sometimes conceived unusual measures, which a specialist would not have hit on at all. The victories of the early years of the war can literally be attributed to Hitler's ignorance of the rules of the game and his layman's delight in decision-making. Since the opposing side was trained to apply rules which Hitler's self-taught autocratic mind did not know and did not use, he achieved surprises. These audacities, coupled with military superiority, were the basis of his early successes. But as soon as setbacks occurred, he suffered shipwreck, like most untrained people. Then his ignorance of the rules of the game was revealed as another kind of incompetence. Then his defects were no longer strengths. The greater the failures became, the more obstinately his incurable amateurishness came to the fore. The tendency to wild decision had long been his forte. Now it speeded his downfall. Well, if he's really heading for any sort of downfall, I shall continue to cover it week by week right here. And also if he's heading for victory. That is what I do each and every week of the year, and it is you in the Time Ghost Army that pay for it. So big hugs for that. And if you are not in the Army and do want me to continue this documentation, then join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are our newest commissioned officers, and our Army member of the week is Moshe Neidell. To see how Hitler got started, check out this Between Two Wars episode about that very subject, and then watch or rewatch the whole Between Two Wars series, because it's awesome. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.
you.